All right, so I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about the midpoint formula. So the midpoint formula essentially is designed to help you quickly get the midpoint between 2 points. So if you take a look, I got 2 points here, one at 1 comma 3 and the other one at 5 comma 8. Essentially, the first thing I usually think of when I'm thinking of 2 points in space is that they're connected by this line, for instance. So essentially, a midpoint is going to be a point that's going to separate this line into two equal parts. So just visually speaking, I'm kind of assuming like this midpoint is going to be somewhere here, right? Because if it was like up here, then obviously it's not splitting that line into two parts. So in order to do this, like the easiest way that I can think of visualizing this is to essentially think of this line as kind of like a slope triangle. So essentially what I mean by that is this diagonal line can be thought of as the slope triangle of like this change in x and this change in y, okay? So if you take a look from the distance from like this point to this point, or at least the slope from this point to this point, you are going over 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces to the right and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces up, okay? If I'm looking for that midpoint, essentially that midpoint is going to be halfway on my x distance and halfway on my y distance, okay? So essentially it would be like this, right? So halfway of the distance of 4 is 2, and then halfway of that vertical distance of 5, which would be 2.5. Now, there's a couple ways you can do the midpoint. You could essentially find out that, yes, there is 2, which is half of my x distance, and 2.5, which is half of my y distance, and then essentially count up 2.5 and go over 2 to get to the midpoint. So you could kind of do it like on graph paper. The other way that you'll see is that this midpoint, which essentially is going to be at 3 comma 5.5, could also be found by averaging the x coordinates of A and B, as well as averaging the y coordinates of A and B. So let me show you what I mean by that. A lot of places online are going to show you this midpoint formula, and actually it works pretty quickly. Essentially all it's asking you to do is average, or in stats we call this the mean, those two x values, and then find the mean of the two y values, or average the two y values. So essentially add them up, divide by 2, because that again would give you that middle point between those two coordinates. So for instance, let me just show you algebraically, or just numerically, how I would get the midpoint of those two same points without even looking at the graph. So here I have the 1 and the 3 for my first coordinate. So this will be x1, y1, and then I have the x2, y2, which is again the x and y coordinate for my second point. Side by side, if you take a look where I plugged everything in, I essentially plugged the two x values in, so 1 and 5, added them up and divided by 2. So 1 plus 5 is 6, divided by 2 is 3. And then if you take a look at the y values, if I add those up, 3 plus 8, 11, divided by 2, you get 5.5. So another way you can go ahead and find the midpoint formula. In all honesty, there's lots of ways to do it. You can either do it kind of graphically, kind of like I explained before, or you can use this midpoint formula, which I actually tend to find pretty useful. If you need a little bit more practice with this, below you can go ahead and find a worksheet full of midpoint problems for you to try, along with the answers, to make sure that you are getting quicker and more efficient at doing this.